Can a video game be art? There have been many videos made about the game Elden Ring. The game came out a couple of years ago now, but with the DLC dropping, I've been revisiting the game and have had time to reflect upon the experience. I grew up playing classic games like The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time or Twilight Princess, and I remember being just enthralled with the story, the mystery, the puzzle solving, and really the sense of adventure of going outside into these rugged landscapes and exploring Hyrule. I also remember the Castlevania games for the NES, and they were really for older children than me, and they were very difficult, but they had a sort of a dark, mysterious, almost gothic quality. I feel like Elden Ring is a little bit The Legend of Zelda for grown-ups, and a little bit the Castlevania series. I've been thinking a bit about why it is that so many people loved Elden Ring. The truth is, I think there are several reasons. One is the gameplay is extremely challenging, and you actually feel rewarded when you defeat a section. It reminds me of those old Castlevania games or the old Zelda games that were just brutal in difficulty, but when you finally learned how to beat a boss, you just felt accomplished. This game, as is true for all the Dark Souls games, really gives you that sense of accomplishment in this digital world. When so many games are really lowering the difficulty level to appeal to more players, this game holds no punches, and no amount of just playing the game over and over and grinding and leveling up your character will really prepare you to beat some of the more difficult bosses. You simply have to do the work, you have to learn the movesets, and as the kids say, you just have to get good. But once you do, there is really just the crushing effect of defeat giving way to the thrill of victory. There's no shortage of compilations of people rage quitting this game online because it's so difficult. And I think that's actually one of the reasons that the game is so popular. I seldom play video games nowadays. I'm a father, I work a lot, and I'm just busy. And this was one of the exceptions that I made, and I'm glad I did. I think the difficulty was one of the reasons I actually stuck with it, because I felt rewarded for defeating an area. And it helped when I talked to some friends and they weren't able to get past the boss, and that's where they quit. And then I found out, yeah, well, you know. I think another reason that people love Elden Ring is because really a social aspect to it. I think it's people look for community nowadays. Just knowing that so many people are playing this game now, I think you kind of feel like you're a part of a cultural event. Another reason people like the game, I think, is it might fill a certain role that's sort of been lost. I think the majority of players are men, but this isn't just true for men. People are competitive and they feel like they want to accomplish something. I think the video game industry realizes this and has really capitalized on it with Pokemon and just various games where they sort of give this element of competition and you have to earn your way through the ranks, thus giving you a feeling of satisfaction. But I think this game takes that to the next level, and it really fills some sort of inner sense or longing for adventure that maybe you're not going to get in modern life. They sort of recreated this medieval high fantasy world in which you can battle dragons. But I think another thing that makes Elden Ring unique is that the beauty of the world is just really unparalleled. I found myself sometimes just playing for a while and then just pausing, not even turning the game off, and I would be done playing and I would just have the character sit and I would just enjoy being in the area. Tolkien said that fantasy should have something called arresting strangeness. This sort of strange, otherworldly mysteriousness to it. So even if it's taking familiar elements that we have in this world, the primary world, it should be combined in such a way that it seems so strange that you just feel attracted to it. I think Elden Ring really does this masterfully. It feels like a lost world that is familiar yet just strange enough. And the creators really do weave in a dark and mysterious beauty. This is true not just for the landscapes, but also the fauna and the wildlife, and I think also the architecture. The storytellers who wrote this script and built this world really do give you the sense that you're in this world that was once beautiful and just magical, but something terribly wrong happened. And it really does remind me of the way I think that the real world, the primary world is. There are beautiful things about this world, truly, but it's clearly not a perfect world. Whatever was meant to be, I think, kind of went wrong. Now this game, I think, has clearly pagan elements to it, and it also clearly has Gnostic elements to it. In other words, the world has become so corrupted in certain places that people will really literally sacrifice their own flesh to escape the corruption that is in the world and become more of this sort of spiritual being. I find this actually to be an unhealthy view of the world, and I've seen some religious people sort of lean that direction. Now, I'm a Christian, and I'm not preaching at you in any way, shape, or form, but I do think a more proper view of the world would be to not have that hard of a dualism between the spiritual world being good and the physical world being bad. I think a proper Christian view would actually be that the physical world is attached to the spiritual world and it's all going to be redeemed. But you actually do find the world builders very heavily borrowing from clearly historic Christendom, from the churches to there being actual bishops to the Gothic architecture, which I find also in a game called Bloodborne, which is set in the Victorian era, but really takes place within this sort of Gothic city. Now you as this tarnished hero have some agency and choice about what you can do in this world and who you want to ultimately succeed. You can be sort of a nihilist, and I don't want to give too many spoilers, but you can choose an ending in which really nothing matters and in a figurative way everything burns, or you can try to do your best to serve a greater cause. And I thought it was interesting, the obvious borrowing from Christianity was in the fact that this world is so broken and there's ruins everywhere, and even heroes who once were good and noble men have now become corrupted in this, it's really sort of a sad story. There are still channels of grace, lost grace scattered throughout the world. So even in the nomenclature, the game clearly does borrow from Christianity. So I don't think it's a strictly Christian game. I don't think it's trying to evangelize anyone, but it's clearly borrowing from an older worldview, which I think also is some reason that deep down it resonates a little bit. I would actually liken it to something like the ancient book Beowulf, which I think has clearly pagan elements to it, but at some point probably became Christianized or blended with Christian ideas. Now, one of the things I found interesting sort of about the world building of this game is that no matter how bad things got, really beauty was not eradicated. Now personally, I believe in the primary world, the real world, that if human beings, as good as we can also be quite nasty. If human beings, the entire collective human race, through the worst, nastiest, violent tendencies that we have en masse all at once at the universe, and did our best to destroy the world as it is, we really couldn't eradicate beauty. If our species went extinct, there would still be beauty built into the world, even if there were no humans around to observe it. I think that's sort of like the nature of Elden Ring. The world builders just did such a great job weaving in this dark and mysterious, even if imperfect beauty. I am reminded of earlier works of literature, for example, Dante or Virgil's Aeneid. And though this game really is not for everyone, it's clearly not for children, and it can be quite violent and disturbing, it has very heavy elements of the grotesque. And my wife and I had an opportunity to travel years ago to Europe, and we're from the United States, but in Europe, contrasted to the shopping malls and landscapes of modern consumerist society, there were these buildings left over from centuries ago before Europeans discovered this continent. And in these little towns in France or England, towering above these townscapes would be cathedral spires. And it was really sort of gave something a central focal point for your eye, that you could see that this did at one point occupy a primary function for the people living in these towns. Now that might not be true as much today, but it is still beautiful. And I was really struck by the contrast between the consumerism that has really engulfed the modern West, especially in my own country. And I think this is yet another reason why people, so many young people, would rather play video games than sort of go outside into modern American townscapes. You're sort of left with the option of, in older towns in Europe, they were built for walking and for community. And in, frankly, so many towns in America, they're built for, they're not planned well, they're just slapped together. You can't walk anywhere safely. And they're not particularly beautiful. They're definitely based on various signs competing for your eye's attention. They see you as a consumer. No, I think it's good to see that so many people now are hiking, going out to the national parks, I think perhaps more than ever before. I think this, coupled with games like Elden Ring, are just little clues about something that's happening in sort of the modern psyche. In the 1800s, there was something called the Oxford Movement. And this was sort of the early modern world after the Enlightenment had begun to industrialize. And people like Tolkien, for example, and of course I think this influenced his work quite a bit, were really upset to see that the destruction of the English landscape. I think he said one time in an interview that he sort of grew up in a world that was closer to the world of Shakespeare, and then as an old man he was living sort of in the modern world. And this was just concerning to him. So in the 1800s there was sort of a sense of loss amongst many English academics, and they started something called the Oxford Movement. And this was sort of an attempt to return to earlier and traditional forms of architecture. Maybe not so much in the, going without modern support systems, but in sort of the styling. So much modern architecture focuses on the functional and rather than the beauty of the thing. I think this has contributed to the depression among so many people today, as we really don't live in beautiful spaces. Contrast that with the beautiful worlds in games like Elden Ring, and I can see why so many people would want to spend more hours in a game that's this aesthetically beautiful than so many of the just consumerist landscapes in which you can't even walk safely through. This is also evidence, I think, in romanticism, which some have actually called C.S. Lewis and his friend Tolkien some form of romantic. I don't think they were literally romantics, but I think they did have some romantic leanings. This is sort of the longing for a return to liberty, nature, sort of tradition, and the beauty of rugged landscapes. All these things I think are very clearly in games like Elden Ring. But I think this again is contrasted against something like a cathedral. I think cathedrals and shopping malls are sort of emblematic of the two different ways of thinking here. I like shopping malls, I like having them around, they're nice, but really they are built purely on a consumerist nature. Or an Amazon warehouse would probably be an even better example. Not aesthetically pleasing, perhaps not the best conditions for people who work there, so we're told, and it's made simply to make money for a function. Contrast that to a cathedral, which takes generations to build. People would spend their entire careers there, investing so much treasure and wealth and talent, and something that would not be completed before they even finished their careers. But they did this because they really believed it was good for posterity. And so even today, centuries later, we still have sort of these remnants from a lost time. But this is really sort of foreign to the modern mind because cathedrals can't be consumed. But they are visible stone reminders of a time in which people believed in more than materialism. But this leads me to ask the question, what is art? And I think art is something very difficult to define. I think we can say what art is not, but it is harder to say, I think, what art is. Now, many people, philosophers I've read, would say that art involves something like creativity. And I think that this game really does possess a creativity that's lacking in many other art forms today. Some people would say, and I tend to agree, that new art forms, when they're invented, sort of will reach their peak and then they'll tend to decline. Some people would say that about novels, that they've already reached their peak and are clearly in decline. And I would say, tragically, that might also be the case with cinema. Though I love movies and I love cinema, I think it's very probably the case that that art form is in just steep and steady decline. But contrast that with something like video games. So people like me would play these things, folks slightly older with, Pong and Asteroids, and then me with Super Mario Brothers and Zelda Ocarina of Time, Twilight Princess. And you see the complexities and the higher budgets that really rival cinema budgets, and the artistic concern that goes into weaving these narratives and worlds. And I think it's quite possible that this is an emerging art form. So I love Super Mario Brothers and The Legend of Zelda: Link to the Past. Those games are always sort of aesthetically pleasing and comforting. But I think that this art form may not yet have reached its peak. But in games like Elden Ring, I suspect that it's sort of making strides towards that. So as other art forms decline, I think it's worth noting, if you want to keep your finger on the pulse of culture, that this emerging art form might take more and more sway against cinema and novels in the future. And future generations might more and more find themselves more enthused with video games. But what do you think? Do you think video games can be art? Is the art improving? What's your favorite moment in Elden Ring? Hey, as always, if you do me a favor, if you keep the comments towards each other civil, I'd very much appreciate that. And I appreciate you watching. I say that quite genuinely. I'm going to try to do my best to make improvements in the video and editing quality of these videos. But in the meantime, I do hope you know that your life is valuable. Someone somewhere loves you. There's always hope. I'd like to encourage you to just keep seeking higher things. As always, thanks for watching. God bless.